Hi, I'm John Atack, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Yuval Laor. We've been trying to make this presentation for, I don't know, about 4 years, and finally we're here. So without further ado, here's Yuval.
So I'm going to be talking about belief and fervor and awe and religious conversion and all sorts of interesting things, and I'm going to talk about them from an evolutionary perspective. Hopefully everything will be clear. So first of all, I want to say that fervor is not religiosity. So a person can be very religious, a true believer, but have low levels of fervor. But a person can also be an atheist with very high levels of fervor. So while there is sometimes, and there are certain religious groups that induce fervor in their believers and followers, it's not the same thing and it's not necessarily overlapping. So let me get a couple of things out of the way ahead of time to set up the argument, because this is going to be a somewhat longer presentation, so we need to establish a lot of things early on. So I'm going to be talking about fervor and awe from an evolutionary perspective, but this is the specific type of evolution or brand of way of thinking of evolution is a part of evolutionary developmental thinking. And this is a very highly recommended book by my thesis advisor, Eva Jablonka and Marian Lamb. And in this kind of evolutionary thinking, culture plays a very different role than normal former way of thinking of evolution, which is very centered around genes and kind of a gene's eye view. So this is very different in ways that I'll explain. So in evolutionary developmental theory, where evolution and development, so the way we changed from monkeys into humans over time and the way we changed from zygotes into humans throughout our development, are very closely related aspect to each other. And if we look at something like literacy, which is not a trait which was selected for, right? Because we know that you can take any human, no matter how many of their ancestors had literacy, and they can, if they're young enough, they can learn it like anybody else. But what we have with literacy, we have culture taking advantage of elements in the evolutionary toolbox to create an actual physical part of the brain that does literacy, allows one of your hands to be able to read and write. So if you have a certain kind of vision, certain kind of motor control, language, memory, and you also need historical people to invent literacy thousands of years ago, and you also need someone to have taught you literacy. But if you combine all those things, you actually get a part of your brain that can do it. And if it was selected for, so if we bred humans who are best good at reading, we can undergo genetic assimilation. So that is like getting dogs that love to herd sheep, where you start with a cultural technology, and then through selection it can become conspicuously easy for humans to develop it. So this is the type of thing that can happen in this kind of evolutionary thinking. And my approach to the psychology of fervor and awe and conversion relies on this kind of thinking. So I'm asking, what were the different elements in the evolutionary toolbox that made the type of belief attachment and fervor and awe to come about? So I think the main ingredients are the different types of love. So we have parent-to-child love, child-to-parent love, which are very, very different things. Then you have teenager-to-parent love, which is yet again very different. And there's sibling loves, but there's also other types of love. There's romantic love, as we'll see. And those interact with symbolic language and with additional elements that I might get to later to bring about fervor in ways that I will describe at length. So, before I continue, some might feel as if I'll be arguing from anecdotes, because I'll be talking about cults, I'll be talking about religious conversion and very high levels of belief, like people with high levels of fervor. And it would seem that you don't have to have high levels of fervor to be religious. You can have religiosity without these extreme states, without sudden religious conversion where you change your life in a weekend. But the thing is that when it comes to psychology of religion, you cannot argue from an anecdote because you're asking about what is commonly out there. When it comes to the evolution of religious psychology, you can argue from an anecdote. So I'll give you a joke. There's a joke about a linguistics conference where there's two camps that hate each other. And to show that they're correct, one of the camps brings on stage a talking dog. And as the dog is talking, people in the audience start yelling, "Can't argue from an anecdote." What's the statistical significance of this finding? But so sometimes arguing from an anecdote is the right thing to do. If in evolutionary thinking, if we find one rabbit that can speak English, we'll rethink all of rabbit evolution, all of evolution of language. So the fact that what I'll be talking about can be rare, or sometimes even very rare, cults that commit suicide, things like that, it can still be used as an argument in the type of argument that I'll be making. So this brings us to talk a little bit about human evolution. First, one thing that humans, between our ape ancestors and us, we underwent a lot of selection for cooperative breeding, which means that we, like meerkats and like wolves and marmosets and other animals, we raise our young collectively or as a group. So extended family members and friends of the family can help in the raising of children, which none of the other great apes do. And also there was selection for emotional control and plasticity. There's good articles on both of those are coming up. And those two things, especially, the cooperative breeding, but also both of them, result in the expansion of family roles and relationships. So even dogs can be members of the family, or you can adopt and be adopted. We'll get to that. And it also leads to an increased variation and expression of love. So as humans with this plasticity, but also once we have language, we can love our country, we can love our football team, we can love our car, we can love groups, love humans, and there's various types of love. But in humans, there's a great increase in the expressions of love. And we can adopt and be adopted throughout our lives, which is sort of, in a way, a kind of falling in love, which is also expanded, of course, with the variation of the expression of love. And that is thanks to the retention of juvenile traits, which means that as adults, we can display the psychologies of children and of teenagers, and we can do that throughout our lives. It's easier when we are children and teenagers, but we can also bring it back. And of course, the major point in the human evolution between us and the apes is the evolution of the capacity for symbolic language, which, as we'll see later, gives us new feelings of knowing, of truth, a feeling of something being true, being a lie, being false. For that, you need language. So, before I continue into some of the more technical parts, or, still going to be interesting, but it's going to be, I want to make a point about one of the conclusions, which I'll get out of the way. And this kind of different types of love psychology that you can develop throughout your life means that someone who is a cult member, for example, someone who is in high levels of fervor, many times they can simultaneously see themselves as a child figure to a parental figure, but they also at the same time think of themselves as a parental figure to a child that they need to take care of and they must protect and make sure they flourish and be very responsible as a cult member. So, and other cult members are like a sibling type of love. So you can have a person who, at the same time, they have a child-to-parent psychology with a cult leader, but a parent-to-child psychology with the group itself. So some people think of cult members just as the child-to-parent aspect of this relationship, where they think of them, a cult member is someone who does whatever the cult leader tells them, and that as such they're robotic, and some people historically refer to as brainwashed. But I think that that's just one aspect of this kind of psychology, where at the same time you can be a child-to-parent psychology with the leader, but parent-to-child psychology with the cult. So if you look at the type of giving that cult members give to their cults, it looks like the type of giving that parents give to their children, not the type of giving that children give to their parents. So a cult member can give up all their money, all their time, not see the faults of the cult, not see the criminality of the cult, and if they do see it, to deny it. And yet, when they're kicked out of the cult, they can be devastated. These are characteristics of parent-to-child love. And this kind of feeling of responsibility to make sure that the cult is flourishing, and this kind of selflessness, we'll see. So that is made possible because, as human domestication made it very plastic for us to be able to see different entities, like a group, which is somewhat abstract, as a child figure. So let's see how all of this happened. In the next parts, I'm going to talk about fervor as a psychological state, and I'm going to compare it to 3 other psychological states. The state of love, specifically infatuated love in various forms, the psychological state that can be seen in people who suffer from temporal lobe epilepsy, some people who are epileptic and become hyper-religious, so they display high levels of fervor because of a neurological condition. And we'll tie it a little bit, we'll talk about the psychological state of mania or hypomania. So let's start with talking about love and infatuated love. So these are the basic prototypes of love. So I added proto here because in wild animals, these would be the basic types of love. In domesticated animals, these would be prototypes because as domesticated animals, we are much more flexible with them. So these are the types of love that are present in all mammals. We have the parent-to-child, child-to-parent, teenager-to-parent, where the teenager still loves their parents, they're just happy when their parents are not around. And you have also sibling love, which is different. In some mammals, about 5 to 10% of mammals, we also see romantic love, which is related to the other types of love. And we have the love of extended family. So these are animals that bring up their young collectively as larger groups. It's 90% of birds that have romantic love, but it's pretty rare among mammals. Romantic love is love that, in addition to courtship and mating behavior, you can have a psychological state that connects two partners beyond the copulation period. So these are usually animals that rear animals together, and they stick with each other, starting with mating, but they would stick together for a year or for a lifetime, depends on the situation. But it is a type of psychological attachment between individuals that starts in the middle of life, usually starts at a certain age. In wild animals and domesticated animals, this can be expanded to longer window, but it is related to parental love, parent-to-child love. It resembles it, but it differs in many ways. First of all, there's sexuality, while in parental love there is the opposite of sexuality. And also with romantic love, the breakups look very different. You can have a switch from love to hate sometimes in romantic love. But as we'll see, there is a lot of elements that are common to especially parent-to-child love and romantic love. So we'll go through a bunch of these. So when we look at parental love prototype, we see that it has 2 modes. There's one mode where I call it the sober mode, where you're a parent, you're a bear, your cubs are playing, you're relaxed, you're not worried. But then when some danger happens, something dangers the cubs, the type of love turns into infatuated parental love, where that bear will murder anybody that it considers to be a threat to the cubs. So we see that parental love can have those 2 modes, and you can alternate between them. And they're related to stress, they're related to danger, and we'll see later. Now, romantic love also has 2 modes, a sober mode and infatuated mode. So in the infatuated mode, this is referred to as limerence by Dorothy Tenov, who made up that term, limerence, because she said that this type of infatuated romantic love, we should not call it love. because love is with another person. And this infatuated romantic love is with an object that you think the other person is. So when you're in the grips of infatuated romantic love, there's problems, which is also why many people make very regretful mistakes as part of their infatuated love, which is, there's a joke about why is divorce so expensive, and it's because it's worth the money. Because of just the level of mistake that some people have realized once the limerence goes away. But many times limerence turns into regular, mature, romantic love, which really is love. And there are many incredible, loving, romantic relationships that never went through a limerent phase. So it doesn't mean that love that didn't go through limerence is not in any way less intense. I'm going to argue that what I will refer to as belief attachment, which is in general this attachment to a set of ideas and a way of life, also can have two modes. It can have a sober mode where you can be a low fervor believer, and you believe, but you don't think about it all the time. You think about it every once in a while. You do the things, but it's not something that you're infatuated with. But there's also the infatuated mode of belief attachment, which I will refer to as fervor. Okay, so I'm going to go through shared characteristics between parental infatuation, limerence, which is the romantic infatuation, and fervor. So let's go through these one by one. So all three of them share an underlying emotion. So in the case of parental love and romantic love, we refer to the emotion also as love. But this is love as an emotion, not love as a psychological state. In the case of fervor, I will refer to the underlying emotion as awe, A-W-E, awe. But it goes by other terms as well. All three of these can be established by strong involuntary emotional experiences. So these type of attachments can start out suddenly or they can start out slowly, but in the case where it's sudden onset of love, you can have very sudden onset of parental love, right? Even without giving birth, right? You find a baby at your doorstep and your life can change suddenly, drastically, and for decades on. We see it also in romantic love at first sight, which is famous from many songs. And you can have a kind of strong awe experience which changes your life, which you can become attached to a set of ideas and a way of life and a group, etc. So all three of them come with strong irrational commitment, and the term irrational here means that it's not based on cost-benefit considerations. Doesn't mean that it's bad in any way, but it means that you're committed to, for example, a baby in a way that is irrational in the sense that you don't measure all the time what are the benefits of me taking care of this baby. So it is a strong commitment that is very resilient and can last many decades or a lifetime. All three of these states can make people neglect other relationships. So I just talked about how strong parental love often is, but many times if the parental figure has an alternative attachment that is infatuated at the moment, for example, another baby, which might be sick, or they fall in love romantically, or they join a cult, they can neglect other responsibilities, even ones that are parental love, romantic love. So it can be a very strong commitment, but sometimes other commitments of this type can override it. And many times this neglecting of other commitments allows people to leave a household and break away from parents and things like that. So it is a natural part of the psychology of different types of love. All three of these states, parental love, romantic love, infatuated romantic love, and fervor are more common among adolescents and young adults. And there's neurological reasons for it, but that is the time of life that many group animals change groups. So a chimpanzee would leave one group and join another group. In the case of chimpanzees, it's females that switch, but that's the time. The onset of all three of these states, parental, romantic, and fervor, make it possible for people to change their life fundamentally. So when it comes to a baby, it makes sense that if you didn't have a baby before, now you have a baby, your life needs to change. And you're psychologically capable of making that change because of the way the psychology of love works, and because the psychology of fervor and also romantic love are related to parental love, they also inherited this ability to suddenly change your life. So a person can go to an intensive weekend of some religious group and come out a changed person, really with different habits. So that is possible. It's rare, but it is possible. All three of these psychological states give people a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose. And all three of them can make people motivated and goal-directed. So it can be a highly motivating psychological state. And all three of them create blind spots and or willful ignorance. So many times it starts out as blind spots and they turn into willful ignorance, or willful blindness sometimes it's called. And what that means is, for example, a parent might have blind spots regarding certain faults of their baby, which makes sense and is natural. And we won't fault parents for it. Also in romantic love, we see that romantic infatuation, we see that there are cases where people have blind spots where they do not see things that are obvious to other people around them about the person that they're in love with. And also with fervor, in the state of fervor, you might have actual blind spots that you don't see problems in the group that you might have fervor towards, or the ideology. Willful ignorance is when you choose not to know. So you're semi-conscious of it. So for example, the TV show The Sopranos, where the husband is a criminal and his wife chooses not to know what he does. So she sort of knows that she shouldn't look into what it is that he does at work, but she chooses not to know. So sometimes you can have this kind of willful blindness, which is semi-conscious, but sometimes it's actual blind spots where you actually do not see faults that would be obvious to everybody else. And as such, these psychological states come with a sensitivity to criticism. So people who are in infatuated love with a child or with a romantic partner would be obviously very sensitive. And similarly, cult members or people who are in a state of fervor regarding their religion or their faith or their ideology might have a very strong sensitivity to criticism, which is why, in the case of cult members, it's advisable not to attack the cult directly as, for example, someone who is a family member of the cult member, because it's not going to be productive. If you criticize the group that they have fervor towards, it's like criticizing someone's baby, and they're not going to listen to you after you criticize them. So you need to be very careful with people in that psychological state. All three of these psychological states come with intrusive thoughts, and sometimes they can include addiction-like behavior. And we'll talk about this more later, but it can happen, and it can overtake a person, so it can be very disruptive to their life, of course. Now, all three of them have an interesting relationship with stress, but at this point, we'll just talk about how stress can increase the level of infatuation. So, for example, stress in a parental sense, when you think there's danger, you think that there's something stressing you about the health of the offspring, that can make you infatuated. And stress in the form of doubt regarding the relationship can make a romantic relationship more infatuated because of stress. And as we'll see, stress can also increase a person's level of fervor. All three of these psychological states, these are romantic and parental infatuation and fervor, tend to settle with time into their sober modes. So this would be healthy parental love, healthy romantic love, sober, and a sober belief attachment. Now, that's one option. Another option is that they can fade away with time. So if there is nothing that keeps it up, if the relationship is severed, over time, the psychological state can actually fade and not settle down into their sober mode. And what determines which one happens is whether or not there is a feedback loop that maintains a person in those psychological states. And we will discuss these types of feedback loops a lot later. And finally, starting at adolescence, people want to be in these psychological states. So people want to be infatuated romantically. Some people want to become parents, which will come with parental infatuation. That changes culturally, of course. There are cultures where people want to become parents or to adopt a child or a pet at different ages, but we have people who don't want to become parents, of course. And there are people who are spiritual seekers, let's say, or people who want to be in the state of fervor. They crave it. Now, let's talk about some of the differences, which are very important. So, first of all, the difference between those three states are different triggers. So if we look at the difference between parental love and romantic love, we see that those are established by very, very different stimuli, right? So a parental love gets established by a baby or by a child or an animal that you adapt. And romantic love gets established when there's sexual attraction based on different psychological history. So we see that those two closely related psychological states, parental love and romantic love, are triggered by completely different things. So it makes sense that their cousin, fervor, would also be triggered by very different things, and that what causes awe, which is the emotion underlying the state of fervor, is going to be the subject that we'll get to later. Another, of course, very important difference is that the type of commitment is different. So in the case of parental love and romantic love, the commitment is to another person. In the case of fervor, because, as I hinted earlier, it is closely related to symbolic language, fervor includes a commitment that is not just limited to another person, but it can also include a commitment to the truth value of a set of ideas, or the truth value of what a person might say, right? Or the truth value that you're not only committed to a person, which might be, for example, a group leader, but you're also committed to the truth value of a book, or the truth value of whatever that person will say. So you can have parental love or romantic love with another person, but completely disagree with what they say. But when it comes to fervor, the commitment can, and this not always, but it can include a commitment to the truth value of a set of ideas. Sometimes you don't know what those ideas are. So you can have a full commitment that whatever it is in that book is true, but you don't know what's in that book. But still, the commitment can be there.